This is the Comics Alternative, episode 202, reviews of Smoke Signal number 25, Fool's Gold, and Briggs Land number 1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week, Andy and I are going to be looking at three really interesting comics. We're going to begin with issue number 25 of the anthology Smoke Signal. After that, we're going to look at a self-published comic by Andy Warner, Fool's Gold. And then we're going to wrap up with issue number 1 of Brian Wood and Mac Chater's Briggs Land. But before we get into those reviews, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And since we're talking about Brian Wood's Briggs Land, you can find that the third issue of that series from Dark Horse Comics on DCB Service for 40% off. So it's $239 for Briggs Land number 3.
So go ahead and get excited about Briggs Land, which we will discuss in a little bit, and get your issues at a great discount at DCB Service, where you can find tons of specials. Their website is dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, we have a lot to discuss, but before we get into this week's reviews, we've got some listener feedback to share with everyone out there.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
And the first bit of feedback is from a friend of mine, and I know that you knew him, but I don't know how well you knew him at Purdue, but Gary Beeson. He listened to our show last week and was also a big fan of Tarzan growing up. And he left us a couple of messages on SpeakPipe. And I say a couple because you can only leave so many minutes of a message on SpeakPipe. And time ran out for the first message. So this is in two parts. So let's listen to what Gary had to say.
Okay.
Hey guys, this is Gary Beeson. I was responding to your podcast with Tarzan. Just wanted to make two quick notes. One, like y'all, I bought the Tarzan books when they came out, read them, loved them. Matter of fact, one of the cool things was my brothers and I, we liked the comics, and we were also big fans of the Johnny Weissmuller movies, which we would see after school. So it was a real nice contrast of Tarzan characters. The other thing, though, is I was going to highlight, y'all mentioned a couple of times talking about how DC was still in the single-issue storylines. One thing I want to note is that, yes, but it's funny because for me, the late 60s and early 70s, especially by the time Tarzan came out, DC was actually doing quite a bit of multi-part stories. For example, in Action, 351 through 353 with the Siobhan character. I don't know if y'all remember that. That was 1967. That was a 3-issue series. And then one of my favorites actually was the Virus X story in Action 362 through 366, right? Had these beautiful Neil Adam covers. And it was a real cool story. Unfortunately, I was buying stuff at the drugstore, issues at the drugstore, so sometimes it was a little hard to get the whole story. And there were other things that DC was doing that was like 2 or 3 issues at the time, like with JLA. But anyway, just want to kind of note that to y'all. Talk to you later. Hey, just a couple more comments I wanted to embellish on, and because I'm feeling pedantic. One of the earliest that I do remember, though, it was when I was born, but I remember reading it. It was in '63, the issues of Superman 164, 165, when Luthor goes to a planet, right? And he actually sort of becomes the hero there because he restores the planet's technology, and it has a red sun. He winds up challenging Superman to a fight there. So I do remember that it was a two-part issue. It was a two-issue story, which was kind of neat. But one of my favorites is still the Sandman saga in Superman from 233 to 242. That was really cool because it was really kind of a subplot. I thought this was kind of more sophisticated because it wasn't a direct plot, but it was a subplot that wound up carrying through multiple issues and was pretty sophisticated in that way. And I believe that was the same was true with several Ra's al Ghul subplots in Detective about that time. And then, of course, there was Kirby's Fourth World, right? It's 1970. And those issues, again, there was a connectedness to it. You kind of felt, I kind of felt lost if I even missed an issue or so of those. Those were kind of neat as well.
So thanks, Gary, for not only leaving feedback, but also for using SpeakPipe. You know, we say every week at the end of the show that people can reach us easily enough via SpeakPipe and leave us a message that way, but hardly anyone does. But Gary, you've set a great example. Thanks for doing that. And, you know, as if we didn't get enough commentary from Gary, he left us a message just, I think, yesterday as we record this on Facebook. Maybe last week's episode really did hit him in a memorable way because he left us a Facebook message. He says, I finally got around to reading the Hillbilly issues, including the Comixology free preview. It's definitely hooked me, though less for the plots than the Rondell character, and I've recommended it to others. His dialogue and style has a great feel, and I'm very much enjoying his art. But one thing has been needling me about this series thus far, the focus on witches. In the preview issue, Rondell confronts an imp, but in issues 1 and 2, his enemies are witches. The title is still young, so we might see more than just bad witches. Yet the power of his cleaver is that it is deadly against witches in particular. I couldn't help but recall the argument that witches represent a hostility toward women. Also, in Appalachian cultures, witches really are not bad. Granny witches appear often to be benevolent. I'm not an expert on Appalachia, so I admittedly skimmed articles about it. From what I've read, witchcraft is not viewed as an evil, but as good, a part of the culture. To clarify, I'm not accusing Powell of misogyny. I don't know him or his intent. I'm sure he's trying to tell a good monster hunter story focused on witches, yet as I continue to read this series, which I plan to do, I have to figure out my response if this point continues to provoke me. This is not on the level of Tarzan's colonialism or the sexism of early Fantastic Four, certainly not Lovecraft's racism. So I don't want to exaggerate. Part of my hand-waving for those creators is they worked in a different time. I try to give contemporary creators a break, but as a reader, I have to figure out when I can't wave my hands anymore and have to let go of something that might be excellent in some respects. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that threshold. So, Again, Gary, thank you for the message.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah. I wonder how much, though, that response might be related to the way, or Eric Powell's response to something like that might be similar to the way he relates to the comic fans in Satan's Sodomy Baby.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what Gary, one of the points that Gary makes that Powell wants to just tell a good horror story with witches is probably all that there is to that. I don't think that there's a whole lot of anthropological research and so on going into Hillbilly or The Goon or any of those books.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see how Hillbilly plays out and if some of what Gary is mentioning here seems to be the case in terms of the witches. I'm really not a student at all of Appalachian culture, of the way that witches figure into that. I didn't even think about the whole misogyny thing as a possibility with the hillbilly. But I mean, I'm with you. I think that the Powell's response would be something like what we were discussing last week with Satan Sodomy Baby 2. Not letting both the right and the left off, kind of being, satirically detached in representing some of his readers' responses. Although, I think Gary does raise an interesting point.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and not only is this feedback, but it's feedback that provokes thought. So, again, thank you, Gary, for sending us this message on Facebook and also for the SpeakPipe messages as well. And we encourage other listeners to chime in, not only about the hillbilly, but anything we discuss on this show.
Yep.
Well, in terms of discussing something on this show, let's go ahead and get to this week's texts. And we're going to start with Smoke Signal number 25. This is published by Desert Island Comics, which is a shop out of Brooklyn. This is the summer 2016 issue, which means it's just recently published. And we should mention that Smoke Signal is a quarterly.
Yeah, and so they provided us also with issue 24, right?
Right, their spring issue. And we want to specifically thank the editor, Gabe Fowler, for sending us those two issues of Smoke Signal. Very kind of him. Now, Andy, let me ask, did you know of Smoke Signal before we got copies?
No, not at all. I had never heard of it before you mentioned it as a possibility for reviewing.
Yeah. This is a relatively new find for me as well. I learned about it last year when I was doing an interview with Tim Lane, who is, in the most recent issue. In fact, he's in a number of the Smoke Signal issues. And in the midst of our interview, he mentioned something about Smoke Signal. And when I was asking him about that outside of the interview questions, he said, "Oh, this is a great publication. You got to check it out." And so I looked at it. So I started reading Smoke Signal beginning with issue number 22. So I had kind of a sense of what to expect, which is one of the reasons why I wanted us to look at this with issue number 25, the summer issue, just having recently come out. So for those who want to find out more about not only Smoke Signal, but Desert Island Comics as a whole, they do have a Tumblr site, which is desertislandcomics.tumblr.com. And that's one word, desertislandcomics.tumblr.com. And you can also buy issues of Smoke Signal, not only the current one, but any of the past issues that they haven't sold out of yet.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah. Although they do tend to sell out, I think, fairly quickly, which is a good sign.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was asking Gabe on Facebook about the origins of Smoke Signal, and he filled me in on a little of its backstory. He said he started publishing Smoke Signal through his shop, Desert Island, in 2009, and it appears quarterly. He said the first two issues were financed by fundraising concerts with bands and venues donating their work. After that, he started to publish it at a loss, occasionally selling ads, but never really exceeding printing costs. So he basically he sells these to people in his store. He also sells it online. It keeps him in the comics game, and he's constantly working with artists, which he enjoys. And as you can see in every issue of Smoke Signal in their table of contents, they also have information about submitting work. So you can contact them about that, and as long as you follow the guidelines of submission, it's open. He may not be able to pay contributors as much as he would like, but he is open to publishing their work if it's good enough.
Yeah, I was curious to read that at the very beginning of each of these issues. And so this issue number 25, it seems to be divided almost kind of in half. The first half being what I'm imagining is kind of common to Smoke Signal from the couple of issues I've read here, which is a series of very short, sometimes one-page stories by different, or comics by different creators. And then the second half, from basically page 20 on, is a portfolio of an artist named Jay Rummel, who was from Montana, and who did a lot of stuff in the 1960s, especially psychedelic poster art and so on, or he's influenced by that. And he died in 1998. So Gabe has done a really good job of curating a bunch of different works by Jay Rummel and preserving them in this latest issue of Smoke Signal.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that's notable about this current issue of Smoke Signal is this information that you just delivered is contained on the first inside page with a Dear Reader information page, where we get this information not only about Jay Rummel, but also about the cover of the summer issue, which is by the great Will Elder. And this is a fun illustration. In fact, it's a cover painting that's titled A Visit to Grandma's, and this was going to be on the third issue, I guess on the cover of the third issue, or at least in the third issue, of Kurtzman's Trump magazine in 1957, but after the second issue of Trump, that publication was no more.
And that the first two issues of that have recently been collected in the Kurtzman library from Fantagraphics, right?
I don't think it's come out yet, but it's about to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. In fact, that's.
I know we got a PDF of it.
Okay. Yes. So that means it won't be long until it sees publication, and I would hope that we can find some time to talk about that on the show.
It's. I said Fantagraphics. It's Dark Horse.
It's Dark Horse. Yes. But I mentioned this information to the reader about Elder and Rummel because this is information that does really set a good context. Now, we don't have that same thing in issue number 24, which is interesting because in issue number 24, the spring issue, not only do we have contributions from a variety of different comics artists, including Tim Lane and Al Columbia, who were also in issue 25, but also paintings or reproductions or illustrations from Salvador Dali and Pedro Friedberg. And there was no context there, which I thought was curious. I would have liked a little more information about the Dali and Friedberg stuff, but it's definitely good to look at.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't know if you mentioned also that Smoke Signal is published in a tabloid format.
Oh yeah, we haven't mentioned that yet.
On newsprint, so it's also an interesting and I think different format. It allows artists to do things on a page, in a full page story or a very, very short story to great effect.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a different kind of reading experience. It's not often that we get comics in this kind of tabloid newsprint, or newsprint at all. And in fact, I'm hearing it right now through your mic, and I'm sure you're hearing it from mine as well. But as we talk about Smoke Signal, we're going to be flipping pages, which quite noticeable because of the newsprint. So
I'm drawing a blank. There was something we looked at a little while ago that came out in a newsprint tabloid. It was an anthology that comes out regularly, but it's not always in that format. One issue just happened to come out that way. Do you remember what it was?
Oh God, I'm drawing a blank now.
Okay. And I thought that was neat then, and I really, again, this is an old school approach to comics, even like older than old school. With this size of page layout harkens back to the earliest newspaper comics, and so it's cool to see someone investing in this kind of retro format.
Right. And we should also mention that just because it's in this kind of retro format doesn't mean that everything is in black and white print.
Right.
There's a lot of black and white, but there's also color as well. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the most, I guess, the notable color piece is in the very center of this issue, and that is Tim Lane's The Assassination of Billy Lyons by that Bad Man Stagger Lee.
Yeah, and that's probably my favorite part of this whole issue because I'm a fan of Derek McCulloch and Shepard Hendricks's Stagger Lee graphic novel.
Right.
And I've taught a kind of Stagger Lee unit in a class before using that and other things and different songs. So I really like Tim Lane's interpretation of that event. It has Stagger Lee being shot by Billy being shot by Stagger Lee through his hat. The gun fires through Billy's hat and into his chest. As Billy's got a knife coming out of it that's dropped out of his hand, but because the hat is such an important part of that story, Tim Lane does a great job of emphasizing that.
Right. Another thing I really appreciate about this, and not just the Stagger Lee centerpiece, but the other contributions that Tim Lane has made to not only this issue of Smoke Signal, but others as well, is they're of a piece with the kind of comics that he does that in one way or another seem to have something to do with American history. In fact, what Lane calls the great American mythological drama. And in fact, when I interviewed him last year, and in fact, for those interested in that interview, it's on our blog. It went up in January of this year. So if you go to the Comics Alternative website and do a search for Tim Lane, you'll find it. We talk about a lot of that Americana stuff. And at the time that we were doing this interview, and it was an email-based interview, he was in the process of doing some of the stuff that we're reading about now, including the stuff he does not only with Stagger Lee, but the story Barnstormer.
Yeah. But what I really like the Barnstormer story, which is about a stunt pilot who comes to town and a young woman basically loses her virginity to him.
Right, Red McQueen,
and I thought that was interesting in relationship to the Tim Lane story in number 24, which is Rebel Comics with Kid McQueen.
Right.
So in both of these stories, Tim Lane draws a kind of rebel outsider figure to look like Steve McQueen.
Right,
and
exactly.
gives him the name McQueen.
Yeah, and in fact, when we were doing this interview, he had really been enmeshed in the Steve McQueen stuff, and he talked a bit about what he was doing with Steve McQueen. Mm-hmm. But again, it's part of this whole Americana thing, right? The very idea of a rebel, someone like a Steve McQueen, is very much a part of American mythology. I know in issue number 23 of Smoke Signal, which is the very first that I've seen, Tim Lane does the cover illustration, which is of a burning steamship or steamboat on the Mississippi. And there are a couple of pieces in that issue that are about the Mississippi. Again, part of the story of America, or as he calls it again, the great American mythological drama.
Yeah.
So it really feeds into a lot of the things that I love about Tim Lane's work. So those were like standout pieces for me in issue number 25 of Smoke Signal. In addition to that, because you mentioned that you really liked the Stagger Lee bit, what other contributions did you feel were most memorable?
Well, yeah. So, I thought Barnstormer was a good story. We get in, probably the thing I got most excited about in here was a new 2-page cosplayer story from Dash Shaw. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about cosplayers before. Yeah, and you mentioned the Al Columbia stuff, and I thought that was hilarious. So but everything in here I found really interesting, and I don't know. I guess giving this anthology a really nice and diverse feel. There's stuff that's Tim Lane's stuff is a pretty straightforward narrative with with his realistic art style, and then there's some abstract stuff, and there's even some kind of non-narrative stuff. I also found, I gotta keep looking back at what the titles of these are. I found Apartment to Be by Siobhan Gallagher, yeah, to be a really, really nicely done short story. It's basically 2 pages, each with a series of 4 panels, and the 4 panels are composed kind of the bodies of 2 people.
Right.
And within each of the 4 panels are three separate points in the lives of these characters. It's a little hard to explain, but it's a really neat experiment in page design, panel layout, and the use of time within a panel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoyed that one as well. I also liked Ali Fitzgerald's based on Leonia by Italio Calvino.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was an interesting story. I want to get back to cosplayers, though. You're right. We've discussed cosplayers in the past. In fact, issue number 1 of Cosplayers,
mm-hmm.
and we're also planning on interviewing Dash Shaw soon on the podcast with the publication of the book Cosplayers from Fantagraphics. We have a digital copy of Cosplayers, and when I saw that there was this 2-pager on Cosplayers in Smoke Signal number 25, I looked through the book to see if this was also in the Fantagraphics book, thinking, of course it is, because the Fantagraphics book is a collection of his cosplayer stories that have come out and others. It's not in there.
Huh.
So I guess this may be something that Shaw could be doing even after the publication of this new Fantagraphics book. He'll keep up with these stories, I guess, in ways similar to what Al Columbia is doing with his Pim and Francie stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I like about what Dash Shaw does in Cosplayers is that he's making commentary about contemporary fan culture in a lot of different ways, but isn't being negative or judgmental
or condescending. Yeah,
or condescending. I mean, this is it is a funny story nonetheless. I mean, about the 2 characters who are going to see the 3rd Hobbit movie, even though they know the first 2 were terrible, and they go see it in 3D and high def, and
they sit in the very front.
Sit in the very front. One of them orders a pizza, and anybody who's ever sat in the very front row of a theater in a 3D movie anyway knows that it is not necessarily a pleasant experience, and so she gets sick,
right,
from it, and then the story ends kind of almost where it began, with an affirmation to go see the new Spider-Man movie, even though the previous 2 movies have kind of sucked.
Yeah, I really like this cosplayer story, and one of my favorite images in this issue of Smoke mm-hmm. Signal is in the upper left-hand panel of the 2nd page, where the character, and it's not Annie, but it's Annie's friend. I can't remember her name. She's sitting right in the front row, and she's looking up at it. I guess it's the beard and mouth of, it could be a Hobbit, it could be Gandalf, who knows. But she's just staring up at this gigantic mouth and beard. And then soon after, she gets nauseated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I thought that was a funny story.
Yep.
I mean, I like... the other contributions that we haven't discussed yet. An Anatomy Lesson. This is by Corinne Katz along with Evia and Norma Ben David. This was a different kind of story. And that's one of the things, though, I like about Smoke Signal is that it's an interesting mix. Now, I've read issues 22 through 25 now, and from what I've seen, they're an interesting mix of, let's say, established names like, let's say Tim Lane, Noah Van Sciver, and also new people that at least I hadn't heard of before.
Right.
Some of the stories are narrative-based. Others seem to be kind of a non-linear kind of storytelling, or maybe no storytelling whatsoever. You'd have something like you have with the majorities of these Jay Rummel pieces, which are more something like, let's say, album or poster art, although some of Rummel's pieces here collected do tell stories.
Yeah. I mean, and when I was kind of circling back here to the Stagger Lee piece that Tim Lane did, I was looking at this, I was thinking, and it is in color, that I might put this up on my office wall as a poster. Now it does have panels, but it isn't a sequential narrative, we could say, from this. And in fact, if you don't know the Stagger Lee story already, the panels probably don't mean a lot.
Right.
But once you do, there's a lot to look at. So that I think is kind of on the line between a comic and poster art.
Yeah. And again, I mean, one of the great things about Smoke Signal is that it does push the boundaries, and it includes a variety of different things. I mean, from more realistic looking art to something that is very abstract. In fact, one of the ways to appreciate Jay Rummel's works that are collected in the last half of the current volume or the current issue is to kind of pull back. This is the way that I read them. Is to pull back and to see what kind of images appear to you, because if you look at it too close with the fine detail of Rummel's art, you may not see what's going on.
Right.
Although looking at it closely gives you a different kind of reading experience, just as pulling back and seeing it from a little bit of a distance gives you another kind of experience. Yeah. Now, we were mentioning earlier that Gabe has an open submission policy. One of the things I particularly liked about issue number 24, the spring issue, is where he includes information about submitting work to Smoke Signal. He says, there are a lot of dudes in this issue. So he's saying, okay, come on, give me people outside of guys to submit to Smoke Signal. So there you go. So if you are a female comics creator and you're looking for an interesting outlet for your work, then definitely check out Smoke Signal. The editor is asking you to.
Yep.
Any final words on Smoke Signal number 25 or 24?
No, they're cool. And so if someone wanted to buy them, they can get them off of the Desert Island Comics website?
Yeah, they go to the Desert Island Web Comics, and I think they sell through Big Cartel.
Okay.
So definitely check them out. And again, the website is desertislandcomics.tumblr.com, and then you'll find links there where you can purchase copies of Smoke Signal. So now we're going to talk about another kind of small press or self-published comic, and this is by Andy Warner. Kind of a long, full title. It's called Fool's Gold, The True Story of the Greatest Lost Treasure in American History and the Man Who Had the Bad Luck to Find It.
Yeah, and so thanks to Andy Warner for sharing this with us, and Andy Warner's stuff can be found at andywarnercomics.com. And his Twitter handle is andycomics.com, and the reason I bring that up is because he beat me to that. I wish I'd gotten Andy Comics instead of Dr. K100, which doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore. But anyway, so So this is a historical story, I guess. Is very recent history, though it does reach back to the 19th century, telling the story about this treasure that was lost at sea. This what is an incredible treasure that was lost at sea in the 1850s, and the man named Tommy Thompson, who
in the 1980s,
in 1980, who spent basically 30 years not only trying to find this treasure, but then dealing with the legal ramifications of what he did to find the treasure.
Right. So the gist of the story isn't so much the sinking of the SS Central America, which is the boat that went down in 1857 off the Carolina coast. It is Thompson doing what he needed to do in order to get the treasure and what happens afterwards. So as the subtitle suggests, he did have the bad luck of finding it because there seemed to be a curse on this gold. And in fact, this comic is divided into 4 parts. The first part is called The Gold, which gives us the background of the ship going down. And then part 2 is The Treasure Hunter, which tells us a little bit about Tommy Thompson. And then part 3 is The Curse, the kind of things he went through after getting the treasure. And then the epilogue, which is where a partner of Tommy's, Bob Evans, goes back years later to revisit this. So, this is the kind of comic that Andy Warner really excels at. You mentioned earlier his website, andywarnercomics.com. So if you want to get a sense, if you don't know of Andy Warner's work, that's definitely a place where you can go to get a sense of the kind of comics that he does. And lately, over the past year or so, he's been doing a lot of stuff for the Nib, some political commentary, fact-based comics. In fact, a lot of the comics that he does is fact-based. Now, I had the pleasure of meeting Andy Warner last year at Small Press Expo, when I was there, and I met him. He was at a table with Dakota McFadzean. Now, Andy and Dakota are 2 of the 3 editors. The other one is DW, and that's his name, or his initials, DW. I didn't meet him at SBX, but those 3 are the editors of Irene, which is an anthology, the 6th issue of which I think is the most recent, and that's distributed by Hickenhock. So I was talking primarily with Andy and Dakota about Irene, but then they also talked about their individual work. And before I left their table, Andy was kind enough to load me up with some of his self-published comics. So there's one that I have called The Man Who Built Beirut, which is about a big builder and a former prime minister of Beirut. Another one I have is called The Palace of Ashes, which is a location in San Francisco where people can still store the ash remains of their loved ones. And then a third, The Complete Brief History of Everyday Objects. And this is in pamphlet self-published form, although we should mention there's a book-length, longer version of Brief Histories of Everyday Objects coming out in early October from Picador.
Okay. That's interesting, and you mentioned earlier on that Andy Warner's does some work for the Nib, and it does his work does feel like it fits that, what the Nib tries to do, which is these nonfiction comics, some historically based, some journalistic in nature.
Mm-hmm. And in this way, the kind of comics that Andy Warner does, he's, I think, one of those few. I think Joe Sacco immediately comes to mind, who is like a comics journalist, because the kind of stuff that he does could be considered comics journalism or comics history or comics editorializing, depending on whatever it is he's doing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm glad to see that kind of comics approach to comics, especially to be really to be getting a lot of attention again, especially with Joe Sacco's kind of a pioneer in that area, but but the Nib is really popularizing nonfiction, essay, and journalistic comics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also reminds me of the stuff that David Collier does. So we need more of this. Now, I don't think that I asked Andy about this when I spoke with him at SPX last year, but I'd be curious to know how he does with the self-published comics of his. Because, I mean, they're really nice because they're, like mini comics, but they seem to be really well made. They're not slapdash put together. And he's been doing this for a while, so I'd be curious to see what kind of success he has been having over the past couple of years or so.
Yeah. Well, it's good. I really dug Fool's Gold. I hadn't, I feel like I may have seen something like a 60 Minutes episode on this.
On the story of Thompson?
Yeah, years ago, and I may be wrong about that. It may have just been another treasure hunt that went bad and didn't yield the kind of riches that everybody thought it would, even though they were pulling up gold left and right, because of the way the investors were operating and lawsuits that followed. They weren't able to realize a whole heck of a lot of it. But then, so you've got the story of this treasure hunt, and then it turns into, starting in the curse section and later into this very strange crime story, basically of Thompson and his girlfriend on the run, and so it's a very short comic, but it takes all these really interesting twists and turns throughout it. And since I wasn't familiar with the story, I was really glad for Warner's comic version of it.
Yeah, you pointed out something important there, and that is, this is not a very long comic, but there's a lot of story told here, and I think that speaks to Warner's ability as a storyteller, whether it be of the fictional or non-fictional mode, is to take something that has a lot of complexity, a lot of facets to it, and to contain it, to condense it into an understandable, relatively brief story. Which he does a really good job of here, and in only 4 short parts. So this is definitely something worth reading and looking for online and at various events where Andy may turn up, other cons like SPX.
Yeah, and I'm glad we're covering this Fool's Gold along with Smoke Signals, because both, I think, are genuinely alternative comics, right? In the sense that you can't. I don't think you can get either of these out of the Diamond catalog, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when Andy sent you your copy of Fool's Gold, did he also include a brief history of canned fruit?
Yes. Yeah.
Which is really good. And this supplement, which is basically just a piece of paper folded over into a 4-page mini comic. I mean, that's just it. It's a brief history of canned fruit, which is the story of Amanda Theodosia Jones and her kind of strange history with canning fruit and becoming a success at that, or at least initially, until men bought the technology out from under her. But I guess this is the kind of stuff that we're going to see in that new book from Picador in October. Brief Histories of Everyday Lives. And in fact, when I saw him at XPX, he gave me something very similar, a little mini comic, The Brief History of the Slinky.
Great.
Yeah. So, and these are, they're fun comics. They're informative and enjoyable. So that has me wanting to pick up this book from Picador in a couple of months.
Yeah, definitely.
So definitely check out Andy's website, andywarnercomics.com. So let's turn from two really alternative comics to one that's a little more mainstreamy, and this is Briggs Land #1. This is written by Brian Wood with art by Mac Chater. Or is it Chater?
I'm not sure.
It's, yeah, Chater, maybe Chater.
Right. Yeah.
And this is from Dark Horse Comics. And this is kind of an extra long first issue. We're used to getting those from Image. I don't think that it's that often that we get a longer first issue from Dark Horse, or maybe we do and I'm just not aware of them. But this is 32 pages of story. Now, you and I are looking off of a review PDF. But, I mean, there are 32 pages of story in this first issue. This is an interesting comic in several ways. I mean, we can talk about the story itself, which I think is compelling. What also makes it interesting is that when this was first solicited, it was already in development for AMC.
Yeah, I find that interesting in that after reading this first issue, this feels like it is a variety of different TV shows, including some that have already appeared on AMC, all mixed together. It's got some Sons of Anarchy in it. It's got Justified, which was on FX, and a lot of the more kind of recent crime series, especially those that deal with families and fringe groups.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk about the story, but let's stick on the whole AMC phenomena.
Yeah.
I know that something that you and I have talked about a couple of times on the show, and I think maybe a little more frequently off mic, is the fact that there's with some publishers, and I think Vertigo being one, when it comes to new stories, they're looking at them as potential TV fodder, like something that you would find on AMC or maybe even Netflix series. And there's a creator friend of yours who has told you this, someone who has worked with Vertigo. And I'm wondering if that is an industry-wide phenomena that we're going to see more and more of. And along with that, I'm wondering if this will work to the benefit or perhaps the detriment of comic storytelling.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things to say about it is that especially for a publisher like Dark Horse, the idea of kind of bringing movie or TV money in through a property has long been something Dark Horse has done with stuff like The Mask and Barbed Wire and stuff like that in the past. But I think that if this is what can keep some creators or some publishers afloat, then I have no problem with that. If artists can do whatever they want with the properties that they own, and companies can do whatever they want with the properties that they own. If somebody doesn't want to sell their property to television or movies, they're entitled to that as well. Now, is this this phenomenon going to encourage creators to be writing comics and drawing comics that are more like television show pilots than they are comic narratives? I don't know, but I think that again, if that's the route the creators want to go with it, as long as there's an audience for it, I don't have a problem with it.
Yeah, I guess where I was going with wondering if this will help or hurt storytelling in comics form is, the last point that you made. If creators are, well, okay, I was about to say if creators are writing with TV in mind, I think that many of them are and have been for years. But if they're doing it in a more overt way, will that have an effect on the kind of storytelling that we get? It's one thing, as we had a couple of years ago with Kirkman's Outcast, we had, one or two issues of that series come out, and then it was picked up by, cable channel? Cinemax. And we thought, ooh, that was kind of quick, right? It seemed a little unusual. Something even quicker is that by the time that we got the solicit of Briggs Land, it was already under development for AMC. So, and like you, I have no problem with this. I'm just kind of curious what kind of effect, if any, this will have on the comics industry in terms of how people tell stories. Now, I do think that reading this first issue, I mean, it strikes me, this definitely has a TV series written all over it. Although I didn't think of those other series that you had mentioned. When I read this, I immediately thought of Brian Wood's other title, and this is a Vertigo title, DMZ.
Well, sure, yeah, and especially in the backstory of DMZ and how we get to that world, it is the phenomenon that we see here of survivalists and sovereigns, the sovereign citizen movement, and so on that sparked the war that set off the DMZ,
right,
or set up the DMZ in that book, and so this is in keeping with stuff that Brian Wood has done before, right? It's not this type of political crime story is not abnormal for Brian Wood. It's just that, I think as a TV property, I can kind of see the executives especially looking at something like this and seeing its connections to those other shows, especially in terms of having this crime family who have declared themselves to be sovereign citizens, and therefore not a part of the United States. They're led by a matriarch, which is again one of the things we've seen on Sons of Anarchy, and I think it was season 2 of Justified that dealt with that as well. So I'm those were where my comparisons came from.
Well, when you think about it, this is not that different from Brian Wood's previous title with Dark Horse, Rebels.
Sure, right.
Because you're still dealing with the same kind of tone, right? Although obviously set in another time period. Now, we've been talking around the story of Briggs Land that's laid out in this first issue, but we haven't really gotten into it. Mm-hmm. The thing I really enjoy about this first issue is that we're thrown in the middle of things, right? So in medias res, where the matriarch that you mentioned, and she's seems to be the protagonist, Grace Briggs, who is the wife of incarcerated Jim Briggs. And so he's head of this family. And you're right, it's a crime family, but they're also like separatist survivalists, right? Mm-hmm. So they have declared land that Jim Briggs owns to be their own nation, not part of the United States anymore. We find out over the course of this first issue that Grace married young, but by the time that we get to the action in the opening pages of issue number 1, she is doubting her place in the family and definitely doubting her husband, to the point that she is starting to do things. And we learn just a little bit of what she does in this first issue, not completely though, but she's starting to do things that he doesn't like. They also have 3 sons, Caleb, Noah, and Isaac. Caleb seems to be the one who is, I guess, the most intellectually frightening. Mm-hmm. If Noah is the more physically frightening, they're the ones who seems to have drunk the father's Kool-Aid. But then the third son, the youngest, Isaac, is someone who Grace confides in, and he's someone who has served over in Afghanistan. And he understands that his father is really screwing things up. And so he seems to be wanting to help his mother. And so over the course of this first issue, after Grace visits her husband in federal prison, and he's in prison for, attempting to assassinate the president?
Right.
Yeah, although we don't have much information about the details. Mm-hmm. So after she visits him, she goes to visit her oldest son, Caleb, picks up Isaac, and they're going back to the Briggs compound, or Briggs Land, I guess. And then how this first issue ends is a big mystery. There's, the violence, and someone is doing something to someone, Grace, but we don't know exactly what. So I thought that this was a really successful first issue. It provides just enough information to hook me, but still leave a number of questions that I'm going to want to come back to definitely continue reading this series.
Yeah, I didn't quite have that stronger positive reaction to it. It does, I think, for people who are fans of Brian Wood's work, it's going to be in keeping with things he's done already. So it'll be, if you're a fan of Brian Wood, it's going to be the kind of thing you look for with Brian Wood's work. I'm kind of hit and miss with his stuff, and I think this one in particular is one I'm probably not going to keep reading, just again because after reading this first issue, I feel like I've seen this before.
Yeah, I'd wondered about your reaction to this, because you told me before that you're not the biggest fan of Brian Wood's comics.
Yeah.
I think I like him better than you do, and so I'm definitely on board for this. Now, will I continue to read this in single issues? I don't know. If I do wait and read it in trade, it won't be because I don't think this is a series that can be read in single issues. And we've talked before about certain series that you get the feeling from the first one or two issues they read better in trade. They probably will read better in trade. I think this could easily read well in single issues, but I may nonetheless wait for the trade in order to keep up with this.
Sure, yeah, and the first issue does end with a cliffhanger that I think
a bang
could make somebody compelled to read the second issue, and certainly may take the series in a direction that's different from the comparisons I made after the first issue. But I guess I feel like I didn't see anything out of this first issue that made me want to follow this series any further. And there are things by Brian Wood I like. I like The Massive, and I've especially liked a lot of his earlier stuff,
like Local.
Yeah, like Local, especially Local. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and the first couple of years of DMZ, but so like I said, I'm kind of hit or miss with him, and this is one I'll probably skip.
Yeah. I'm also wondering if our different reactions of this first issue may stem from the fact that I'm not familiar. I know of Justified and Sons of Anarchy, but I haven't watched those, and I haven't read the Sons of Anarchy comic. So for me, this didn't seem as much, I guess, old hat or something I was familiar with as it was for you.
Yeah, that could very well be. I'm really curious about what. If again, it's in development, so we don't know how far along it's going to get before it reaches, if it reaches, the air on AMC. But I'm curious to see what the reaction to it will be once it does air on AMC, because again, AMC viewers are probably going to already have been familiar with Sons of Anarchy, especially. So how will they respond to this?
Right. And another aspect to that, I think, is AMC has had such success over the past several years, especially since Walking Dead and Breaking Bad, that any kind of new series like this, I think, comes with its high expectation. So, I can just imagine that there's going to be, if this appears on AMC on Sunday nights, there's going to be the Nerdist, right? Instead of Talking Dead, this may be Talking Briggs. This has all of the stamps of something like that. And, I think that's potentially exciting. On the other hand, at least with me in the case of Preacher, there was a lot of build-up and expectation to that. And I think part of my feeling of being let down, at least initially, with Preacher, is because of the big AMC machine behind that new series. And so I'm hoping that the AMC machine behind Briggsland doesn't raise my expectations to where I feel a little let down. Because I definitely want to watch this when it comes out.
Okay.
They really are playing this up, even in comics form. I don't know if you noticed those emails that we were getting during the San Diego Comic-Con.
Right.
Which I thought were kind of clever. we got a series of emails over several days that, I mean, there weren't much to those emails, but the gist of this was Briggs Land meet certain characters. And so the first email we got was Briggs Land meet Grace. And then after that, meet the ATF special agents Nolan and Ziegler. And then the Sons meet Caleb, meet Noah, meet Isaac. I thought that was a fairly effective way of teasing this new comic. So Dark Horse is definitely putting a lot behind this, and I'm sure that AMC will do the same. So there you go, Andy. The books we discussed for this week were Smoke Signal, issue number 25. This is published through Desert Island Comics. After that, we looked at Andy Warner's Fool's Gold, a self-published mini-comic. Really interesting. And then we wrapped up with Brian Wood and Mac Chater's Briggs Land #1. So 3 very different titles. Although, as you pointed out, I'm glad that we started off with 2 self-published or very alternative indie kind of publications.
Yes.
So definitely check those out. And if you want to check out great comics all the time, then you definitely have to visit the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Unfortunately, you won't be able to find copies of Andy Warner's comics there yet, or Smoke Signal, but you can nonetheless find great discounts on other comics. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, and you visit the websites of Smoke Signal and Andy Warner Comics, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about the books that we discussed this week. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. So be like our friend Gary Beeson. Leave us a message that way, won't you? Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also check out our Twitter feed. It's at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. But you can also find us other places in the social media world, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can listen to us via Spotify, and if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can still find every single episode of the podcast, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. Check us out on all those venues.
That's right. And let us hear from you. And we will be back next week with more fun stuff. Until then, take care. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.